business development has, it can be a lot of different things depending on your size and scale of what you're trying to do. When we talk about B2B or business to business growth, business development to me means that I am looking for new markets. I am looking for new relationships. I am looking for new, in my case, because I'm with the in the not-for-profit sector, I'm looking for new corporations, new public sector partners that have donor bases. So for me, is what are those markets? What is the total assailable market that I'm looking for, and how do I strategically market myself in those different markets so that I can grow our business? And that essentially for me is what it means to me. And in my case right now, I work for a very large charity, and that charity is always looking for both private sector and public sector partnerships to grow their revenue. And how do you actually then find aligned value between that corporate partner and what you're doing, so that you can find some common ground, so that you can both have a viable relationship that's going to, one, grow your needs, but also grow their needs as far as what they're looking for. So that to me is finding that commonality, and looking for those markets and finding the right strategy that's going to get you into those markets. And you used a great example there where if it's your personal brand and you're using social or those types of, that is a different type of market, because you're actually just talking about yourself, and you don't have something external to you that you're bringing into this conversation that needs to find that alignment.
Yeah. And so when I was in business development at a consulting company, I would get so much anxiety, making phone calls, and I didn't like when my coworkers could hear me. So I would lock myself in the boardroom, and I would do all these processes to try to get myself to calm down before I was doing my work. And then eventually they kicked me out of the boardroom, and they're like, you have to sit at your cubicle. And so when it comes to that experience of kind of following following the rules of an organization, and then possibly breaking them, and then having anxiety with coworkers, or that pressure, that kind of, because that kind of, it feels, for me, it felt external, that's kind of external pressure. How do you process that when you're, maybe when you started, how did you start to process that and actually be able to move through it with some sense of confidence? Or
so I think there's a couple different things there, and I'm going to sort of start off early in my I've been working in sales since I was about 13 years old, and I did everything through university, through high school and university, that was that sort of traditional, either selling retail or cold calling, which is, I think, probably a little bit more along the lines of what you were talking about with regards to the consulting. And what I found over time for myself is that I needed to find value in what I was actually going out to market with and actually selling, or bringing to market, or looking for new markets. And that's one of the reasons why, I started off my sort of official professional career in financial services. So I was working at the big banks, and I was selling product, and I was building portfolios, and I was doing all of these things. But at the end of the day, what I felt was value centric for me, I wasn't finding that it was totally selfless, or it had sort of a lot of value for the end recipient, which was the purchaser of those services. So I felt it was very one way. And at some point in my career, I had to make a choice, and that's why I ended up in the not-for-profit sector, because then I could find some value in what I was bringing to market, in that I felt really, really comfortable talking about and providing a value that I knew that the community was going to be better off in general, as well as the company or the donors were going to be better off because of this collaboration. So I think that was the mind switch for me, is that I really needed to believe in what I was bringing to market. And I think that's key for anything. And as an entrepreneur, that's vested in you. You're bringing yourself to market because you've got everything that you have invested in whatever you're sort of promoting or doing within yourself. So that, I think, is a little bit easier as an entrepreneur. But when you're in the corporate setting, I think it is kind of difficult because you really need to find that sort of sweet spot for you in believing what you're bringing to market. And that to me was that transition where I left the private sector and came to the not-for-profit sector.
Yeah. Okay. So with your skills, like from a history in banking and finance versus philanthropy, like what would you say are some of the transferable things that happen? What are some of the different, you touched on the differences of the feeling of like the actual experience. So what are some of the similarities and differences of the skill set, and like, how did you make that transition?
I think the biggest thing that is the transferable skill set, I'm going to actually start a little bit backwards than that. The first thing I'd say is that the language, the feeling, the emotion that comes with it changes between, you're profit motivated as an entrepreneur or as a business. That becomes a little bit more altruistic, so to speak, when you look at the not-for-profit sector. So the language change is huge. Like you heard me say, for instance, corporate partners rather than B2B, which is what it would be referred to in the sort of real world, not the not-for-profit world. But in the not-for-profit world, we talk about them as partners rather than a business having a business relationship. So it's little nuances like that change. So the language changes dramatically between. But what I do find is the curiosity factor is transferable. The ability to, like, when you and I sit down, I'm going to ask you questions. I want to know more about you. I want to know what's going on in your life. And that, I think, is that curiosity. And that leads to finding out what the needs of that partner relationship that you're looking for. So that ability to keep on digging, to ask open-ended questions, to keep layering in, to make sure that you're finding out as much data and things that are important to that relationship, that then you can then build a mutual plan or whatever you need to do that's going to drive that relationship, continue to drive it forward. And I think that is probably the biggest transferable skill, is that you become you should be at that point a very good listener, and you should be able to ask those types of probing questions that kind of just let, like you're doing right now. You ask me a question and I just keep talking because people want to relay that. And the more that you can do that, the more that you can find alignment and find that shared value.
Right. And how did your background in finance, like how did it shape your perspective that you have now? And like with nonprofit, how does it shape the perspective to kind of like how you approach and respond to your experience?
I think it can be both a positive and a negative again. I think initially I came in, my background is in economics. I came in with that finance type of background, excuse me. And there was this real sort of clear thought, and that was, going on 12 years ago or longer now. But I came in with, there's a market solution for things. And I've come to understand that that's not the case. And I even took that in university. There's the not-for-profit sector, the public sector, and the private sector all exist because they don't do the same jobs. And I think when I came in to the not-for-profit sector, I kind of forgot that lesson, is that if there was a market solution for this, it would have been solved. The not-for-profit sector doesn't work that way. So you need to listen to all stakeholders. You need to understand that problems aren't solved overnight. That things, so for me, that was, again, another learning, is that I came in with these assumptions that there should be solution sets for this, and found out that there's a lot of gray in between, and that it isn't easily solvable like that.
And what is a market solution?
A market solution is, I'm going to sort of use the stock market as a easy, there's a buying and selling of things that creates an efficiency that needs some regulation and that has this sort of market. Social services, which is the area that I work in, doesn't have market solutions. You wouldn't have, it's the same type of analogy where we use the US healthcare system versus the Canadian healthcare system. US healthcare system is a market-based type of system, whereas the Canadian system is a universal healthcare system. We all pay into it. It's a different type of animal. Those two things work very differently from each other. And one is we're finding, you can, right now we can see the differences in those two things, but that market-based solution isn't the answer for everything. And I think sometimes when we come in from the private sector, we think that there's a market-based solution for everything, and that's just not the case.
So I remember an event that when I was on the bureau, like speaking at Scotiabank, and it was the most amount of people that I'd ever spoken to. And you were there, like, and I think that's when I met you, and I felt intimidated. And then, like, going into the room, I felt intimidated. With business development, like, you have to move through it, like, in front of the other person, like in front of people that are looking at you, like hoping to, make a connection. Like you want to have a connection, and you want to like feel relaxed, and you want to show that curiosity that you were talking about earlier. But then it's like, just as being a human, like sometimes there's an energy, and I just, like, me and many entrepreneurs and many young people, like, we can't find that like place where we can kind of relax into it. And I remember as well, like when I was younger, like I didn't have any suits, like I didn't have any like professional clothes, and like that was something that it's strange, it's silly, because so many young people don't have like a closet full of suits.
Yeah.
But it really makes a difference, like walking into a room and just feeling intimidated, and that social status, like hierarchy thing, like how when you were younger, or like if you were meeting
even now,
like how do you like actually deal with the moment?
I think it's funny that I will sort of lay this out too. I'm very introverted, but I spend a lot of time in front of people. And like I said, I grew up as a salesperson. So you're constantly putting yourself out there, and that sort of acceptance or rejection or however you want is always sort of in the back of your mind. But some of the, and a lot of it is repetition of things that I know that work to bring me to be present, so that I'm not thinking forward, I'm not thinking behind, I'm not thinking about what happened 4 weeks ago and that didn't go the way that I planned. And I'm not thinking about, oh, if I do this properly, this is the next 6 chess moves that are going to happen. So I think there's a couple things that I have to go through all the time, and one of them is to stay present, to know that I'm being of service to this conversation. If I'm being of service to you, and that we're having a back and forth, and that I've been asked to come and be with you, then that's a privilege that I'm here for, and I've got to accept that. And breathing, keeping calm, all of those things that I think either a practice of meditation or, all of those, I go into meetings with that little bit of a mantra going, is that I'm going to be of service to this. I've done this before. I'm not an imposter. I deserve to be here. I'm going to stay in the moment, and I'm going to ask questions because I want to be the best version of myself here. And I think those things really, if I'm going to tomorrow morning, I've got to do a demo of a digital platform for a group of 25 people that are going to be C-suite to IT specialists, and I don't know any of them. But so I go in there with a little bit of trepidation, but I go through that process, and make sure that I'm going to be present, that I'm going to be of service to this whole conversation, and that I'm breathing deeply and I'm not getting myself worked up before I even walk in too. And those kind of things just help center me and make sure that I'm not, and I might start 15 minutes before the meeting even gets to that point, before I go through that process in advance of that, so that I'm setting myself up for success that way.
Right. And like when you do have a fumble, or like where there is kind of the energy feels like it's dwindling or something, how do you recover from that? Or how do you recover from rejection even after the fact, after a meeting or situation?
The rejection is unfortunately part of the job. And this is just from a straight data, if you've got a goal of raising $5 million of revenue and you've got 110 new relationships that you've got to build, you've got to have 400 conversations to get to those 100. That's your pipeline's got to be that big in order for you to be successful on that big. So that's the kind of thing that and I think that repetition, and that kind of going through the process, realizing, and then debriefing afterwards, if I did screw something up, it's not the end of the world. It's going to, and a lot of the times too, I think I've screwed up and I haven't. It's a lot of self-doubt or a little bit of imposter syndrome going on. But I think that there's a lot of learning that you go through after the fact is, oh, maybe I should have approached this differently. Maybe I should have asked this question, or maybe I should have done this to start, the question, the conversation off, so that people felt comfortable to stop, ask questions, and continue. I find I work much better in that framework. For me personally, is that I don't want to be the person talking. I want to be the person either doing the questioning, taking notes, making sure I'm getting as much information as I can, and it depends on which stage of the conversation, whether you're in discovery, whether you're in demo, whether, what part of that sort of spectrum you're in, but going in with a little bit of an agenda and prepared, but being able to pivot wherever it needs to go, and taking deep breaths, slowing down. Things go much quicker in my head than they actually do in real time. So I think sometimes I can actually start to talk too fast, or I get going, or I think I've flubbed something up, and I'll just stop, and gather my breath, take a second. Nobody knows what's going on in your head. So I think there's a lot of those sort of, I think a lot of it comes down to breathing, keeping yourself centered, and not trying to get ahead of yourself and get in your own head, and keep focused on the people in front of you, not on yourself. This isn't about me. This is about them, and learning more about them.
And when you mentioned like physical preparation, like when you're going into a meeting, how do you prepare from a research standpoint before, like, let's say reaching out to a new person or a new company, and how do you prepare for the physical meeting from a research standpoint?
Sometimes there will be Dun and Bradstreet, sometimes there will be people that do some of that research for you. I always try to do, LinkedIn is a fantastic tool. LinkedIn Navigator is a side tool to LinkedIn, and you can actually go and search people and find out who they're connected to, and draw a little bit of a map, and maybe there might be a connection between somebody and somebody they know. And so LinkedIn Navigator is something that I use quite a bit. And then I go and research the company, and find out, for me, it's because I'm in the not-for-profit space, what is their what is their corporate social responsibility? What is their value statements? What are their purpose? What is their corporate mission with regards to sustainability and things like that. So I will go in and do that. And usually, that might be another hour's work just to gather more data. But I also don't want too much of that to hamstring me. I want to ask those questions to find out, tell me about your employee base. Tell me about some big open questions that I can actually layer into afterwards. But generally, I map out a little bit of an agenda, some square boxes in it, and I will actually map out a little bit of detail, and then I go into the conversation and just take notes. And that usually is the discovery process, which is the first part of building that relationship before you get into anything else.
And you mentioned like before moving into not-for-profit to help like find alignment for yourself as a person. So within that space, like within a company or organization, even if there is alignment, for anyone who is watching, who is working somewhere, like, and there is alignment for, they feel it or they don't feel it, it's like, how do you create your own like process or identity when it might not be like totally following the recommended procedure like from the company. So for example, when I worked at the consulting company and they gave me a script, I like couldn't follow it. Like it just would not, I couldn't say these words. I couldn't like, so that's part of why I locked myself in the boardroom, because I was just like having a normal conversation without any technical language. And that's why I didn't want them to hear me. But like, like it's just, when you have to be a person, like be an individual, but be within an organization or a company that has policies and procedures, and they have them for a reason. Like, how do you let your identity or like your own just personality like come through in a way where it's still respectful and it's still in alignment, and
That's tough, and because I can see it from the employer's point of view. They've got a tried and true practice. They're paying you to do a certain job, and then this is the way that they see it fit. For me, I can't. I think you need those diverse personalities. I think you need, and if the results show that your personality is getting the appointment, is understanding, and is closing deals, then that's probably the better path. But I don't know if, I know that there's some companies that have very strict policies with regards to that. And I don't know if you can rectify that, I think that is one of those things where you try, and you try and you fail, and then you get up and you start again, and maybe it's somewhere else.
Did you feel that in banking? Like, did you feel like the process was?
I felt towards the end of my time that it was, that it was more about the revenue stream than it was about the client. Now I know that a lot of that has changed over the years too. But for me, that was sort of that point where things needed to change for me, and I had to make that decision. I wasn't going to be able to change that system, but it was more about the client really wasn't driving the conversation so much, and I think and a lot of that I think has changed over the years, but that's where I was at that point. But I think that is one of those things where it wasn't working for me anymore. So I had to find something else and find something that was much more value centric for me.
And so many years ago, I was at this mentoring session, and it was at like one of the banks, and like they had multiple tables in the room where like little groups of women sat at the tables, and then they had like executives come over and like they rotated. So after each conversation, like they rotated to the next table and each person had a different major topic to cover. And so one person that sat down who was male was like, you know, if you reach out to me, like get to the point, like tell me what you want. And then like, I'll just connect you to the person that if I can connect you to someone, or I'll like, you know, set up a meeting or whatever. And then when we rotated, then there was a female that sat down and she said the opposite. She was like, tell me the backstory, like, let me understand like where you're coming from and all this stuff. And because it's not like, I wasn't doing like a statistical like analysis of the room because I hadn't talked to enough executives. But because of the happenstance, like the circumstance, I asked them, I was like, is there a difference, you know, reaching out to like someone who identifies as like male versus someone who identifies as female? Like, is there a difference? And I know that when we're actually living life, like we notice patterns, we notice themes. So in that situation, it could have just been a difference in personality, like had nothing to do with gender, just a difference in personality, but they wouldn't address the question, like because they like, it was just awkward. It was just an awkward moment. So we're in situations, sometimes we have to be a little bit disarming, or we have to be a little bit like extra compassionate. Like how, when you're meeting with people, like how do you read it? Like how, if you feel a wall or if you feel a disconnect, like how do you process that and move through that?
I think it comes back to a lot of, you know, and understanding who I am, and, you know, and the amount of privilege that I have. And I think that's, you hit a lot of things there that are probably, you know, a whole nother conversation for me. But being able to read the personalities in the room and being able to know that, you know, when I leave a meeting and I've got my notes in front of me, you're either really energized or you want to move on to the next call. Like, I think that just comes with practice, is that, and I'm going to use your example of those two distinct experiences you had, and one just happened to be male and female. And I've had the exact same in opposite too. Okay. Where, you know, and I find it much more that some people are very transactional. They just want to in and out. They just want the meat on the bones, and that's it. And everything else is kind of superfluous to whatever their sort of agenda is, as opposed to somebody like I was just talking about, who wants to be curious, who wants to know more, who wants to make sure that you're aligned with that next right opportunity. But the only way you do that is by engaging and having a meaningful conversation about it and collecting enough data so that you can carry on with it. So I think that to me is I'm not afraid to move on. And that, again, it comes back to that. If you've got to have 400 conversations to get to the 100 that are meaningful, that's the process you got to go through. You got to have a big enough pipeline in order to fill, and that can be one-on-one relationships, or it can be corporate relationship. You know, I think it's the same thing, is that if you're out meeting people, you're gonna hit on those 10 lousy transactional relationships, and you just got to be able to move on and detach from it. Okay. Because it's not personal. It really isn't personal. It's just the way that people are.
Yeah, because I obsess. Like if especially like political things, like I just get into this obsessive loop, and I can't like because it's almost like I'm trying to figure it out and at the same time be objective, where I'm like, no, it's just every human being is different. Like, and it's just so strange. Like, it's so strange how, I don't know. Yeah, I get like both. Well, sometimes I can remind myself that everyone's just.
And I think when you put it in that sort of context where you have, and this is again where you know, if you get an agenda that's so tight and packed, you're going to stick to that, and it's going to get very transactional, as opposed to, I got 3 questions I want to ask you, and I want to just see where this conversation goes, because I want to learn more, and I'm going to ask a few more layering questions, and that becomes a much more relationship based type of and that you walk away from energized, because yeah, now we've got some commonality. Now I know what you're looking for, and that we can move forward, and I can build a mutual plan from that. The other one, you don't want a relationship with me, you just want to get me off your desk.
Yeah.
So yeah, I can, and I've had the same, you know, there's some personality traits, I think, is probably a better way of, and I really have to be able to say to myself, it's not about me. Like this has nothing to do, you know, whatever's going on in their day, whatever their kids did, whatever's sitting on their desk that they can't shake in the back of their head and they're ruminating on for the next 45 minutes while they're supposed to be talking to me. Yeah, I have no control over that. So I got to let it go.
Okay. So, so something I noticed online is you are a motorcycle person, and like you've gone on long trips and so what I wanted to ask, because I think I've struggled with this. I think a lot of young people have struggled with this. How do you decide, like when sharing like personal aspects of your life that may impact your relationships or the way that people perceive you in business? How do you navigate it? Because I've had this issue, like where I will feel that, you know, me being like, if I do something that's more personal, like it can go either way. Like someone can be like, oh, I don't like her, and then another person might be curious about something. So when it comes to relationship building and like sharing personal things online, do you have a philosophy? Because like I feel like so many young people are like scared about like what they have online, or they're like, maybe they're trying to build something and like make themselves into like a leader in their industry, but they're still scared about like companies and organizations, and when they're meeting with someone, like coming off a certain way or whatever else. Like, how do you navigate it?
It's a great question. And it's, you know, I think there's sort of a space for personal brand. You know, who you are, what is important to you, those types of things, I think should come out in your social. And you know, if I think about it, you know, my arms are covered in tattoos. I ride motorcycles all over the world. My partner, she is the exact same way. She works in the financial services sector and is very much, and she's got the same thing. So, you know, I think there's a change in corporate that is much more accepting of that individuality now. Um, but I also think that you've got to take responsibility for the things you say and do, because those are, you know, words have meaning. And I think you've got to be careful with regards to making sure that you're not just regurgitating things that could be hurtful or could be in the wrong space, or, you know, but I tend not to have, you know, what you see online and what you see of my personal brand, I'm completely comfortable with. And if that makes somebody I'm meeting with not, or make a judgment about me, or, you know, then again, I got to let that roll off my back a little bit, because maybe this wasn't meant to be, and maybe this is pushing me in another direction, and I've got to move on to the next relationship, and I got to be okay with that. But I got to be me. You know, I can't. And I tried being somebody else, and that didn't work. So.
And okay, so is there anything specific from your work that you wanted to share? Anything like upcoming events or projects that you wanted anyone to connect with online?
You know, I'm working in a little bit of a weird space right now, in that you know, and the pandemic has really sort of amplified that in digital transformation within and I work for United Way, so I have a lot of corporate relationships that are trying to engage with their employees differently and work differently. So that has been always um, something that I'm passionate about, and that I work hard towards. But you know, if anything, I think what we've noticed is that community right now in this present moment needs each other more than anything. And I think for me, it's been a really neat experience to watch the relevancy of the organization that I work for, United Way, really come to the forefront. You know, convening tables all across the city that bring those communities together that need to learn about health issues, food insecurity, all of those things that have really sort of separated people over the last 20 years. And each region of the city really needs that help more than ever. So that to me has been really relevant. And I would encourage people to learn more about their community and do a quick search on your social for anything that is going on in the community with regards to United Way.
Okay.